Think knights in shining armor won every medieval battle? What if the real heroes never even stepped onto a horse? The stories you know, sword-swinging nobles and chivalric duels. Miss the people who actually held the line. Today we're exposing the crucial warriors you've never seen on a museum shield, and why history keeps forgetting them. Ready to find out why longbowmen, peasants, and women warriors determined the outcome of wars while knights got all the glory? Stay with us as we shatter centuries of myths and reveal the unsung fighters who truly won the Middle Ages. Ever notice how every medieval movie makes knights look like superheroes? They're always the center of attention: big, shiny armor, warhorses that seem more muscle than horse, and charges that shake the ground. You'd think every battle was just a stage for these armored celebrities. The reality? Most people in medieval times could no more afford to be a knight than to launch their own rocket to space. In fact, knights made up a tiny slice of the actual army. Imagine going to a football game, expecting a full team of athletes, and realizing 9 out of 10 players are actually just local fans wearing borrowed shoes and hoping not to get trampled. That's how lopsided medieval armies really were. Let's talk numbers, because the stats break this myth wide open. For every knight in armor, there were sometimes dozens, yes, dozens, of ordinary foot soldiers, archers, and guys with whatever sharp tool they could sneak from the kitchen. By some estimates, a fancy knight might have had 4 squires and even more servants, just to help him put on his armor and drag him onto a horse. Most medieval armies were poor, scrappy, and hoping nobody called their bluff. So where did this comic book version of knights taking charge come from? Simple. History got edited by the winners and those with grand titles. Who wrote the chronicles? The same guys who could actually write, which usually meant the rich and the noble. They picked up pens as easily as they picked up swords and made themselves the main characters, leaving common soldiers to the background. But let's talk about what knights brought to the table. Besides a lot of metal and maybe a big ego, armor wasn't cheap or practical. Those shiny suits that look so cool in museums? Imagine wearing one in a hot car in July. Knights often sweated so much inside that metal shell they basically sat in their own sauna, which did nothing for the smell or the fighting mood. Sword fighting looks awesome, but plate armor meant you clanked around like a medieval washing machine filled with rocks. In a real fight, knights could get stuck in mud so deep they needed help just to stand up. Horses, no matter how well trained, didn't always cooperate. Loud noises, walls of spikes, sudden piles of fallen bodies. One unexpected moment, and even a well-bred warhorse could go from majestic steed to leaping disaster. Sometimes, battles looked less like epic duels and more like a traffic jam on a rainy day. Picture this. A field full of armor-plated warriors, slogging through knee-deep mud, horses losing their footing, the clash of metal barely rising above the chaos. At the Battle of Agincourt in 1415, the French knights charged again and again, banners flying and armor gleaming. You'd expect victory. Instead, they hit a wall, literally. The mud was so thick fallen horses and men became obstacles. And above it all, arrows rained down from English longbowmen, toppling knights before they could even get close. If you dig up those old battlefields today, archaeologists find that most skeletons belong to infantry, not golden boys in full plate. Most of the dead had no armor at all, just worn-out shoes and whatever scrap of leather passed for protection. The myth of knights falling bravely. Well, sometimes they just slipped and never got back up. Everyone loves a good hero story, and knights played up to that. They had the best gear, the family crests, and their own hype squads. Medieval poets and chroniclers lining up to turn noble disaster into almost glory. When you hear about knightly virtues, chivalry, honor, epic duels, remember that most men marching to war brought nothing but a stick and a lot of hope. Hundreds might gather under a local banner, but only a handful wore armor that actually fit. The real armies were hungry for food, not glory. The guys with the best stories survived. And guess who made sure their stories sounded amazing? Knights and nobles, of course. Even old paintings help push the myth, showing nothing but rows of heroes on horseback, while everyone else fades into the dirt. There's no denying knights looked impressive and had skills with a sword, but they struggled in real battles where mud, rain, and sharp sticks didn't respect noble birth. A horse could be spooked by a noise and throw an entire plan into chaos. Fancy armor worked, as long as you didn't have to run, climb, or dodge a flying arrow. They were also slower, not just in movement, but in decisions. Orders passed from noble to noble, while everyone else waited, and sometimes watched disaster unfold in slow motion. The most surprising find? Researchers opening medieval graves often find the so-called heroes with little to no armor. The big-budget knights you see in Hollywood, a handful at most. At Agincourt, where French nobility expected a quick win, most were left behind in the mud, while lightweight soldiers ran circles around them. The stats alone reveal the truth. Knights were outnumbered, often overwhelmed, and sometimes completely bypassed by less glamorous opponents. Yet they walked away with all the credit, because they controlled the stories, and the historians listened. That's the real jaw-dropper here. While knights got the paintings, poems, and parade armor, it was the forces behind the scenes making the difference. So if knights weren't the ones sweeping through to win the battle, who actually had the power to turn the tide? Now we're getting to the force that could bring down a knight before he ever saw what hit him. Let's forget swords for a second, because the most feared weapon on a medieval battlefield could be found in the hands of a guy holding nothing but a long stick with some string. The longbowman was the medieval version of a sniper, and if you picture battles like Crécy or Agincourt, it's not just chargers on horseback who matter. It's thousands of archers standing in the mud, quietly stringing their bows while knights lined up ready to look heroic. The weather wasn't just gloomy, it was strategy. Mud made knights even slower, but for archers, the only thing to watch out for was a stray arrow or the risk of trench foot. You'd see rows of armored nobility all clustered together, supposedly unstoppable, but facing a storm of arrows that didn't care how shiny your helmet looked. There's this idea that armor made knights untouchable, kind of like superheroes in steel pajamas. Reality? The longbow didn't just ruin the illusion, it often ruined the guy inside the armor, too. These bows fired at draw weights so high that practicing archers built up bodies with muscles you'd more likely find on Olympic powerlifters than the average farmer. The longbow itself was a thing of beauty, made mostly from wood, patiently grown, and imported from places like Italy or Spain. Yes, London's livery guilds actually ordered European yew in bulk, the medieval version of a sports equipment deal. The final bows were close to 2 meters long, and could fling arrows with enough force to smash through mail and even good plate. At Crécy in 1346, you didn't just see arrows bounce off. It was thanks for the armor. Now here's one through your knee. Now, training for the longbow wasn't playtime. The English crown got pretty serious. By law, every boy started archery practice at age 7. Skip a Sunday session at the butts, the local shooting range in your village, and you could get in trouble. This went on for years, so when war came, those archers were as well drilled as any sport team, maybe more. Draw weights were brutal, something like 100 pounds, sometimes even reaching 160 pounds on rare bows. That's like pulling on a bow that would tear a regular gym-goer's shoulder. And the payoff? A trained archer could launch as many as 12 arrows in a single minute. Try sending 12 texts in 60 seconds and see how fast your thumbs get tired. It's still slower than a medieval longbowman. Expert research tells us the psychological impact of a rain of arrows could hardly be overstated. Horses broke ranks and bolted. Knights who counted on their armor had to make a choice: risk their lives on a terrified horse in chaos, or dismount and wade through a mud bath, all while arrows whistled by. Sometimes arrows would literally punch through helmets and bones. There's archaeological evidence for this, too. Study after study has found arrowheads embedded in human remains, and researchers have compared arrow wounds to injuries caused by submachine guns. One study actually describes arrows spinning as they hit, giving wounds on par with hollow-point bullets. That's not just deadly, it's a little terrifying. If you think being an archer meant you got to stand around solo, you're missing the real secret. Teamwork didn't start with people playing soccer. Longbowmen moved as a coordinated group, unleashing arrows in tight, disciplined volleys, while protected by wooden stakes planted in the ground. At Agincourt, these archers worked together so well that French knights couldn't get anywhere near before being blanketed with arrows. And they were smart, setting up at the top of a gentle rise, forcing attackers to slog uphill through mud while every English archer aimed for anything that moved. It's no wonder French cavalry ended up piled in heaps, horses panicking, and men blocked by the bodies in front of them. You wouldn't want to be in the middle, trust me. Medieval battlefields have left more than just armor behind. In places like mass graves from these famous battles, most skeletons aren't covered in fancy metal. They show the kind of trauma you get from powerful arrows. Bones split, skulls pierced, armor with holes in all the wrong places. Even the famous Mary Rose shipwreck, pulled from the sea centuries after it sank, showed the physical legacy of this weapon. The skeletons of the archers had warped shoulders and twisted arms from using bows this powerful for years. Their bodies were changed by the demands of constant training and the sheer strength needed to pull a longbow. You wouldn't believe it, but the real superheroes at these battles were regular men, sometimes just sons of farmers, teachers, also the guy you'd see at the village pub. They had strong arms, thick nerves, and a willingness to keep calm and fire fast, even while chaos was all around them. The heroes who actually won the day at places like Agincourt never rode a warhorse or wore gilded armor. Instead, their arrows darkened the sky and turned a charge of knights into a pileup that no one wanted to repeat. This changes everything you thought you knew. Archers did more than just support. They could decide the outcome before the knights even got close. But if you still think all the power was in the hands of these seasoned archers, think again. The toughest defenders sometimes had even less training and equipment, yet when everything else failed, they refused to panic and held their ground. So here's the reality most history books skip over. Peasant militias were much more than the warm bodies meant to slow down the knights. Ask yourself, if you round up a bunch of farmers and local workers, what do you expect? Maybe people who run at the first sign of danger? Turns out, sometimes they fought harder than anyone, because it wasn't just a battlefield, it was their backyard, their families, their livestock, and the only home they'd ever known. When local nobles called up their banners, that impressive-looking army was more likely padded out with men who usually spent their days mucking out stalls or hauling sacks of grain, not practicing swordplay. Even teenagers could get roped into the mess, with all the actual skill of someone who'd only ever fought with a shovel. These weren't career soldiers, they were the original, bring-your-own-pitchfork crowd. Yet somehow these scrappy bands kept showing up in surprising places, and once they landed on a field, they changed the rules. What did they really have going for them? It wasn't armor or war horses, or even proper weapons in most cases. Their biggest superpower was something knights never picked up in a joust, knowing every bump, bog, and shortcut for miles around. A knight in glimmering plate armor might look impressive, but try marching him off his fancy path, and he'd look lost as a tourist without Google Maps. Peasant militias, on the other hand, used every muddy ditch, foxhole, and bramble patch to turn a noble's parade into a disaster. They learned this because losing a fight meant losing the entire village, not just for them, but for everyone. When it's survival on the line, you don't care about looking good. You care about getting home in one piece. Let's talk about the Swiss. The Swiss militias, often just regular herders and townsmen, pulled off some of the biggest upsets in medieval warfare. Picture the Habsburgs, decked out in shiny armor, convinced no group of peasants could possibly outfight them. Except, at places like Morgarten in 1315, the Swiss used their mountains like secret weapons. They waited by narrow passes and lakes, where the knights' horses slipped and stumbled. When the timing was right, the Swiss hit them with pikes, those ridiculously long spears that could poke through armor and throw horses into a panic. The Habsburgs' grand charge turned into a confused pileup, and those mountain peasants sent nobility home with more than just bruised egos. And it wasn't a fluke. At Laupen in 1339, the same thing happened. Knights ended up learning just how sharp a farmer's tool could be. The Flemish had their own moves, too. Ever heard of the Battle of the Golden Spurs? In 1302, peasant militias in Flanders, armed with not much more than the Godendag, a cheap, club-like weapon with a spike, ended up smashing a French knightly force. It sounds almost cartoonish. Men with what were basically fancy sticks and crowbars facing off against rows of shining cavalry. The French expected a quick stomp, but instead, Flemish fighters held their ground, waited for the mud to slow the horses, and then jabbed away with everything they had. That day, peasant militias demonstrated the effectiveness of peasant militias in challenging the dominance of the nobility. Records from the battle show knights completely outmaneuvered by men who'd never even owned a proper sword. Now, if you think improvised weapons can't break up an actual cavalry charge, the Swiss pike formation and the Flemish Godendag should change your mind. Stakes sharpened sticks, anything that could stop several tons of horse. With enough determination, these rough tools worked better than gold-plated swords. And these guys weren't above using anything sharp they'd find in their barns. A cavalry charge would hit a wall of pikes, horses would rear or fall, and knights would end up thrown into the mud, easy targets for everyone else. The so-called peasant rabble turned local dirt and farming gear into the medieval version of a home field advantage. Records show that uprisings, though risky, sometimes toppled entire armies filled with titled nobles. Desperate people, tired of paying taxes or losing crops to war, grabbed whatever they could and launched full-scale rebellions. Across Europe, from Germany to France, there are stories of peasant revolts that, while often ending in brutal crackdowns, sometimes created enough chaos that well-trained nobles had to run for their lives. When you're fighting for your own house, or for a slice of bread, you learn to fight smarter and dirtier. A knight might dream of glory. A peasant dreams of making it through the winter. That brings up another huge difference: motivation. Knights acted by a code, glory, chivalry, honor, all the things that sound good in poems. But peasants fought out of necessity. Their tactics didn't require official approval or a sense of fair play. Ambushes, hidden traps, and the skillful use of terrain weren't signs of cowardice. They were signs of determination. If a knight lost, maybe he paid a ransom. If a peasant lost, he risked everything he loved. That's why when local militias faced down professional armies, the results could shock everyone, except maybe the villagers themselves. Even official chroniclers sometimes admitted that the common people managed to snatch victories from the jaws of certain defeat. What made all of this work? A deep understanding of the land, a willingness to fight with anything, and the fierce drive that comes from protecting your own. Victories like Morgarten and the Golden Spurs weren't luck. They were the results of desperation, teamwork, and knowing how to turn a muddy field or a narrow bridge into an unbreakable line. You wouldn't want to meet this kind of defender in a dark forest or on a foggy morning. So, if you once imagined peasants as just the extras in a movie about knights, think again. The real battle often hinged on the locals who made every scrap of land count. Here's something else for you to consider. The story of medieval combat isn't just about men with swords or women watching from the windows. Some of the bravest defenders in these crisis moments weren't men at all. Next up, let's talk about the warriors who held the line in ways that history hardly ever mentions. They might just surprise you. It's easy to imagine every woman in the Middle Ages stuck behind a spinning wheel or waving goodbye from the castle window, but that image misses most of the story. We all know Joan of Arc because she's the poster child for women with swords, but for every Joan, there were countless other women who fought, worked, and hustled right alongside the men, sometimes saving entire armies and never even earning so much as a footnote. The myth that women played no role in medieval warfare besides sewing a nice banner or praying quietly at home. That's the kind of idea you get when history gets written by the guys who wanted to keep their club exclusive. Society in medieval times made some big, bold rules, like women should stay home and let the men handle the fighting. But real life had other plans. Sieges, invasions, and everyday chaos definitely didn't pause to ask about gender roles. When attackers showed up outside the town gate or enemy armies marched through the countryside, everyone who could move was suddenly part of the war effort. If you'd been living in a besieged castle when the enemy started lobbing rocks and setting fires, you'd quickly learn that surviving had nothing to do with who stirred the soup or who wore the armor. Let's talk about those castle sieges. History has record after record of women taking active roles on the battlements. Not just waving handkerchiefs, but dumping boiling oil and molten pitch on ladders, blinding invaders with sand, even grabbing bows themselves. There are stories of women racing up to the walls with buckets of water to put out fires, hauling stones, and shoving wooden beams into place to block battering rams. In some castles, noblewomen organized food and water rations while making sure everyone kept their posts. One well-known English siege saw a group of women take charge after the male defenders panicked. They dumped stones, whipped up a defensive fire, and managed to keep the attackers at bay long enough for reinforcements to arrive. No one handed out medals, but if they'd flinched, the defenders would have been overrun. Behind those castle walls, women kept things running in ways that mattered far more than any actual sword fight. While knights got all the glory for brave charges, women were the quartermasters of survival. Recent studies show women managed farms and estates while the men were away, making sure that the food didn't run out and the sheep didn't disappear in the night. Noblewomen organized deliveries of food and equipment, pulled together wounded soldiers, and doled out soup, bread, and whatever protein they could scrounge up. Without this background work, even the flashiest army ended up hungry and useless. Castles and camps were often run by a mix of nurses, cooks, armorers, and spies, whose work kept armies alive. That part matters, even if it doesn't show up on a tapestry. Medical care was another battlefield you rarely see pictured. Women brought herbal knowledge and midwifery skills straight to the front lines, setting broken bones and brewing potions to ease pain or fight off infection. Studies point out that medical care during medieval battles relied heavily on women, from noblewomen converting castle rooms into impromptu hospitals, to village healers patching up wounded men who staggered back from the field. If you were injured in a dirty battle outside a medieval city, your best chance at surviving wasn't some miracle doctor, but women who knew their way around a bandage and maybe a poultice of yarrow or sage. And then there were the invisible soldiers, the ones history labeled as camp followers, but who really kept armies from falling apart. Picture this: armies on the march for weeks, far from home, tired and hungry. Who roasted the pigs, mended the shirts, cleaned the weapons, or watched the children? It was usually women, usually without pay or thanks. And they weren't just cooking, they were fixing armor, passing along news from village to village, and sometimes doing some very effective spying. Women also played a vital role in intelligence gathering and espionage, using everyone's assumptions to slip behind enemy lines, pretend to be traitors, or simply overhear plans no one thought they'd understand. Some of the best information that reached generals about troop movements or stored supplies came from women with sharp eyes or a good memory for faces. You'd think their work came with a thank you card, but being caught with a sword or even found near the front lines could mean trouble. Women faced real punishment, banishment, fines, or worse. Most records listed them as unknowns, or scribes simply erased their names to keep proper order. Yet the evidence is there. Archaeological digs at old camps turn up hairpins, sewing needles, shoes in women's sizes, and clever little tools. Nothing to do with knightly duels, but everything to do with survival. Even today, you can dig near a medieval camp and find personal items that tell the story of someone who was there, working through all the mud and chaos. Beyond the work, women were also a source of steady nerves for armies with nothing but mud and terror to look forward to. Letters from loved ones, tokens of affection, and the promise of reunion gave soldiers the mental strength to endure the hardships of campaign life, highlighting the importance of women in maintaining the psychological well-being of the troops. Imagine trudging through rain and filth, hungry and bruised, then finding a note from home hidden under a sack of grain, a reminder that someone out there believed you'd return. That's an army's real fuel when the fighting drags on. So, the Invisible Army wasn't just a crowd of men with swords, it was anybody who picked up a pot, a rock, a needle, or a bandage whenever survival called for it. The stories of women's contributions don't always turn up in grand family trees or shiny armor displays, but their work ran through every victory and every hard-won stand. But here's the thing, it wasn't just muscle and numbers that won these wars. Sometimes, the real game changer was the person with the know-how to make the impossible actually possible. Let's try something that medieval movies almost never do. Focus on the people who knew how things really worked. Forget the knight charging at a castle gate. Let's talk about the techies of the Middle Ages, the ones who figured out that if you can't go through a wall, you bring the wall down. Picture the engineers, carpenters, cooks, and a whole parade of support staff working together, while knights stand around looking confused. Castles were supposed to be impossible to conquer, tied up with layers of stone, clever drawbridges, and moats that smelled worse than last week's garbage. All very impressive, until some genius on the other side thought up a way to knock a hole through all that obvious invincibility. Castles were built with weak spots. Nobody likes to talk about it, but every wall has a soft patch or a badly placed supply door. The smart people knew where to look. Knights would crash against stone with swords and fancy armor, but siege engineers had better ideas. They brought along trebuchets, giant slingshots that could launch boulders bigger than a fridge. One good hit, and part of your wall becomes next year's gravel. Or they'd roll up battering rams to smash doors until the strongest oak cried uncle. Some engineers got down in the mud and tried something sneakier, sending in sappers to dig tunnels under the walls. If the tunnels were dug right, you could collapse an entire corner and open up a new entrance, usually at the most inconvenient moment for defenders. Sometimes, siege warfare went from mud and hammers to fire and smoke. Early chemical tricks, like Greek fire, showed up on the battlefield. This wasn't just your regular campfire gone wrong. Greek fire was a flammable substance that was difficult to extinguish and could be used to set fire to enemy fortifications and siege engines. Try fighting when everything around you is exploding or covered in sticky, burning goo. Suddenly, the safest plan is getting far away from the wall you thought would hold. The big, showy sieges really made the techies shine. Think about the fall of Constantinople in 1453. The Ottoman army showed up with the biggest cannons anyone had ever seen, each one the medieval version of a monster truck. The walls, famous for turning back invaders for centuries, finally got punched full of holes, because the engineers figured out how to move and fire those cannons right up to the city, not to mention dragging ships across land to surprise everyone on the water. That wasn't brute force. That was pure cleverness and a masterclass in logistics. If you want another story of brains winning over brawn, take the siege of Rochester Castle in 1215. King John's army didn't win by charging in. Instead, engineers got to work, built siege engines to breach the castle's defenses, including undermining the walls. The sappers and carpenters worked for weeks, chipping away, planting supports, and finally burning and collapsing a whole stretch of stone. No epic duel, no dramatic last stand, just a wall giving out under the feet of tired defenders. All these plans were useless unless you could keep your own army in one piece. Logistics mattered so much more than anyone wants to admit. Cooks had the thankless job of keeping people fed, boiling whatever they could get hands on. Carpenters and smiths fixed broken carts, sharpened weapons, and built quick bridges when rivers got in the way. If the army ran out of food, everyone quit. If the weapons broke, you lost. The ability to supply an army, build roads, and maintain weapons often determined the outcome. Every great siege rested on these unpopular details. Forget honor. If the stew spoiled or the bolts ran out, the whole plan was finished. But the real magic of medieval siege warfare came from knowledge, tucked away in blueprint sketches and careful notes. Medieval engineers weren't just winging it. Some left behind records that look like the world's first IKEA instructions, complete with measurements and details about how to rig up catapults or trestles. These records reveal the sophistication of medieval engineering and the meticulous planning that went into siege operations. They drew up plans for bridges over moats, wheels for lifting boulders, and systems for moving men and supplies fast. They even wrote about which woods to use, how to bind ropes so they wouldn't snap, and the sweet spot for burning stakes under enemy gates. It wasn't just invention for its own sake. The siege engineers and their support clubs made or broke armies. They solved problems on the fly that nobody in a suit of armor could fix with muscle alone. Sometimes a castle fell not because it ran out of defenders, but because the water supply got cut. An engineer working silently in the night, not a knight in shining armor, made the difference. In the end, the quiet force behind most victories were often people you've never seen in a history book: engineers, carpenters, cooks, the unsung experts who made victory possible. Their tools weren't shiny swords but blueprints, hammers, and sacks of flour. You wouldn't brag about being the guy who fixes carts or boils the stew, but when history's biggest walls came crashing down, the names you never learned were the ones who actually toppled a kingdom. So if all these people were doing the heavy lifting and designing, digging, and building, what does this leave for the poor knight and his storybook reputation? Turns out, history gives a lot of credit to the guy on horseback, when most of the work happened far from the saddle. Think about those famous battle scenes. Always a knight gleaming at the front. But real victories went to the archers who darkened the sky, the peasants who turned muddy fields into traps, and the women who turned kitchens into hospital wards. People like engineers and cooks, the unsung masses, as one historian put it, shaped the outcome of war more than any sword-waving noble. If you want to find the real power behind a medieval army, skip the stories about shiny armor and look for the footprints in the mud. Next time you see a knight on a cereal box, ask yourself who's missing.